All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Thursday, December 16th of 2021. Thanks for tuning into the stream. Of course, whether you watch this show live here or listen to it or watch it back as a recording, appreciate all of you guys. If this is your first time watching the stream, I know we continue to get new viewers here every single day. This show's open Q&A. I answer questions that we get in through email, through Slack, through YouTube, about SaberSim, about DFS, really whatever you guys want to talk about. You guys drive the show. We've got some good questions here already in the queue here today, talking about managing the lineup pool and what it means when you kind of exceed that lineup pool. We've got questions about some of my strategies that I've talked about in some of my videos, building the high upside NFL DFS lineups and running research builds and things like that. Some contest selection, kind of satellite questions about how to approach contests that are outside of your normal maybe play. Percentiles, curating a player pool for NFL Showdowns. So all kinds of stuff in the queue here for tonight. We do have a pretty good looking NFL Showdown game on tap for tonight, which is exciting. Of course, normal NBA and hockey slates. I have been waiting with bated breath here pretty much every day now, hoping that games aren't getting canceled. So hopefully we manage to get through our little 4-game NBA slate with a full four games of NBA played. I don't think there were any cancellations last night, which is great. But I know the Sacramento Kings are in a little bit of doubt for their Friday game. So we'll just see how it all works out. But definitely hoping everything goes off with without too much of a hitch. NBA DFS in particular, we all know already has enough going on without adding in the COVID drama on a night-to-night basis. But I had the bittersweet opportunity yesterday of going to watch my Nuggets get blown out at home by the Timberwolves, which was unfortunate, but managed to take down the single game showdown. I guess it's not showdown on FanDuel, but the single game contest for that game. While I was sitting in the stands, built a couple lineups on SaberSim on my phone before the game started, and ended up taking down the contest. So ended up being a profitable evening for me, if not the most enjoyable evening. I mean, I had a great time either way. It's always fun going to the game, but my Nuggets are not looking so hot this year. But anyway, nobody cares about all that. We'll go ahead. Let's start diving in and start tackling some questions here. As always, go ahead, pop your questions into the Office Hours channel in Slack or in YouTube chat if you've got them. I'm actually going to start here with this question that came in about an hour ago here. Let's go ahead. We'll bounce over to the NBA slate for today and do that. And this is from Joseph here. I think it's a good question to start with. He said, I've been building 1,500 lineup pools. When dialing in, I understand why it will ask build more lineups. And I typically build more lineups to satisfy my dial-ins. But is that SaberSim saying, hold off, pal, you're straying a little too far from optimal? Am I doing a disservice when getting so dialed in with what SaberSim is saying wouldn't even make my top 1,500? And I think this is a pretty good question. And I think there's kind of a little bit of nuance here. It's not necessarily a yes or no answer, but what we're referring to here, right? Let's just show off what we're talking about here first. Is when you build a lineup, and in this case, I'm only going to have 500 lineups. So Joseph says he's building with a full 1,500 pool. But let's go ahead and build with 500. And you can get this message to show up relatively easily just by starting to remove some of the favorite plays on the slate, right? If we just start taking some of these guys off and just slowly start removing, and we say, I don't want to play any of these guys. And I'm sure that's not exactly what's being done here, but we start doing this. And eventually we're going to say we need to expand the lineup pool to match your exposures, continue building, right? So the question here is this going too far off the board? I typically, I guess let me move this so you guys can see. This is the message I'm referring to, right? And so the question's asking, am I going too far off the board here? And I think in some ways the answer is yes, right? I mean, what is literally being stated here is that when you're building 500 lineups and we want to find the best 20 out of them, you have made so many changes at this point that we can't find any 20, right, that fit this. And what I typically like to say is that when you're thinking about your lineup pool, you can often think about this as a pool of 500 lineups that are all viable for the contest you're playing. And the things you do here on step 3 are dialing that in and doing some quality control and helping the selection process of those 20 lineups. When you exceed this pool of 500, it is well said, I would say here overall, that you are exceeding what SaberSim thinks are maybe the first 500 viable lineups for the contest.
So what does that mean? Well, for me personally, I like to take that as a little bit of a flag of saying, hey, let's think about where's your takes coming from? Where's your strategy for the slate coming from? Do you have a gut feel? Are you working a lot with intuition? What level of confidence do you have about the way you want to approach the slate that's getting you there? There are going to be times where maybe you read a well-researched article, or you have your own particular research process, or you really want to take an aggressive stand on a slate for one reason or another, or you just don't think that SaberSim's modeling a particular game or slate very well. That's completely fine to say, no, I actually kind of disagree here. There are far more than just 500 viable lineups for this particular contest that are playable. So these are by no means the only 500 lineups that are playable. In fact, you're not even going to consistently get the same 500 lineups every single time you build with SaberSim, which just there in itself basically says that these are obviously not the only 500 that are playable. And the higher your sim variance slider is, and the more players in the pool, the bigger the slate, etc., the less likely you are to get the same 500 lineups every single time. So I do think it's a good opportunity to check, to say, let me make sure that I'm confident in my overall stand on the slate. And if not, maybe I pull back on that a little bit and play within kind of the first 500 or 1,500 lineups that SaberSim already thinks is optimal. But if you've decided, no, I'm well-researched here, there are a few things that I disagree with the model on, there's a few ways that I want to attack the slate that are a little bit different than what the first 500 or 1,500 I'm getting are, and I want to go from there, I do think that you will be better served in general by going back to step one and making some adjustments here to build yourself a better pool overall. So if you're seeing that message frequently, I would say go back to step one, make some adjustments to projections or ownership, or even setting min and max exposures here in step one to get the slate to look a little bit more like you think it's going to play out, or the edge or the angle that you want to tackle on this particular slate. And the reason why is that if you get here into step three, and even if you're selecting 20 lineups out of 1,500, if you are putting a ton of exposure settings here in step three, and maybe you're ending up with kind of the last 20 lineups that are basically available in your original pool, you've almost arrived there just by process of elimination. It's just that so happens to be that these 20 lineups are the 20 lineups left over in the pool that fit what you've requested. If you go back to step one and make adjustments to projections or exposures or ownership here in step one, we're going to build you a better pool that better identifies the best lineups and gives you probably better lineups overall, right? The point of building, and I know I keep just flipping back and forth here, but the point of building the 500 or 1,500 lineups in the first place is twofold. The first one, and the functional primary reason, is so that you can edit these exposures and do some quality controlling here without having to build additional lineups. I think that's one of the most tedious parts of other optimizers, is that as you're dialing in those exposures, you have to run a build of your 150 or whatever it is, and then check the exposures and then tweak some things and then do another build and tweak some things and do another thing. It's very nice that you don't have to do that here on SaberSim. But the other reason is that the more lineups you build in the first place, the more confidently you can say that the 20 that you're choosing are the best 20, right? So when you're left in a situation where, because of just process of elimination, you are picking the 20 lineups that just so happen to fit your exposures, you're losing that second value a bit. You're not really getting the opportunity to get the best lineups for that particular slate. You're just getting the ones that are kind of left. And yes, those are viable lineups. They work. You're probably not playing bad lineups, but you could squeeze out a little bit of an additional edge by going back and maybe making some better ones. So it's a really good question here. To summarize, I think anytime you see that you need to build more lineups to meet these exposures, it is a very good opportunity to pause, ask yourself, where is my stance coming from, right? Where is my research coming from? Do I trust that? Do I believe in that? I mean, do I want to invest in that? That's essentially kind of what we're doing here with our DFS lineups, because SaberSim is a model, right? It's a sophisticated model. It has a take, but it is not necessarily going to be able to account for everything or perfectly model everything every night, right? There are things that it's going to miss. There are ways to add value. So ask yourself, how confident am I in that? And if you're confident and you want to kind of plant your flag there, go back to step one, make some adjustments to projections, ownership, exposure there to build you a better pool to match what you're trying to do in step three. By the same coin, I would say, instead of sitting there when that message pops up and just over and over clicking, yes, build more lineups, yes, build more lineups, yes, build more lineups, until finally the exposures are met, just go back to step one and make some adjustments and build yourself a better pool to begin with, is my recommendation. But It's a really good question, and that comes up often. I will say the one other thing that can happen here. So in this particular question, I was kind of answering this from the lens of you're taking a strong stance on a certain player, right, that the model disagrees with, and that's why you're seeing the message. You can also see that message saying you need to build more lineups if you just put a lot of different exposure settings in to a lot of different players. Like I know there are some players out there that prefer to have a min and max exposure set for almost every single player in the pool. Doing that, if you do that for enough players, is also likely to butt you up against this 500 or 1500 lineup limit. If that were the case, that I would also go back and do that here on step one. So there's two real ways that you can see that message. The first is by basically just outright disagreeing with our model on who the best plays are on a few different players, or you can have this death by 1,000 cuts kind of thing, where if you're putting a min and max exposure on every single player on the pool, you're going to run into some limits there. So, but good question there. I see Wes is here. Wes says, just joined SaberSim through RPS. I'm here to learn this awesome optimizer. Welcome, Wes. He said, is there a video on the stacking rules groups, preferably for showdown purposes? I'll direct you to our YouTube channel and show off a video that I think will help. But as always, if you have any specific questions, happy to answer anything. But on our YouTube channel, we've got this NFL course here. And we did a video at the start of the season here. I know it's kind of long. It's a little over an hour here. With talking about our recommendations, our 3 rules to beating NFL Showdown in single games when you're using SaberSim. But I do think Brandon's point here, no need for groups or rules when using SaberSim. The builder does it for you automatically. That's mostly true. I would agree with that. The reason why, and I think just a very important concept to grasp here when you're using SaberSim that's just completely different, frankly, than anything else out there, is that our projections are not just average projections. We actually simulate the game out play by play thousands of times and plot essentially the entire range of outcomes of a player for the game tonight, for example. All of this is basically what percentage of the sims do certain players score a certain amount of points in. We also know exactly how correlated certain players are to one another based on what comes out in the sims. So when you build lineups for an NFL Showdown, for example, right? Let's say you're building 20 lineups and you build these. I'm not setting any rules of any kind, right? The lineups that we're going to get here at the end are not just pure luck combinations of players because they fit and have a good average projection. These are actually individual optimals from single game simulations from our thousands of sims of the game. So you're going to see that many of these lineups follow the traditional rules that you would want from an optimizer, right? You may get a Joshua Palmer captain lineup, which of course then has Justin Herbert, who's throwing him the ball. You get a Travis Kelce lineup, which has Patrick Mahomes in the lineup, who of course throws him the ball here, right? When you get like Mike Williams here, let's see if I can find I'm looking for one that's maybe a little bit weird. What you will see though sometimes is you'll get lineups that maybe break the rules, right? That do something a little bit unconventional. Can't see one off the top of my head. You might see quarterback captain with the opposing team defense, or 2 tight ends from the same team, or 2 running backs from the same team, right? These players that are traditionally thought of as negatively correlated that maybe would be ruled out if you were using a traditional optimizer and setting all these kinds of rules. You can still go in and remove those lineups, but you have the confidence of knowing that there's still a game sim represented by those lineups. And as we see regularly every single week, unconventional lineups can frequently win Showdown. And in fact, a lot of times they do so with very high expected value because they're so unlikely to be duplicated. So there are rules and groups and strategies that you can apply for your Showdown contest. I would recommend doing some things to try to add some value. If you're interested in our best recommendations of where to go to do that, I would check out this video because it's pretty comprehensive. But what you may be used to of what you have to do to build good lineups on a traditional optimizer, you really don't have to do here because the lineups themselves are already resting on the strength of a game sim that represents the lineups. Your goal, I think, actually here is better thought of for Showdown using SaberSim as trying to select the best 20 or 150 or however many lineups you're playing for the particular contest you're playing, rather than trying to program the optimizer to give you the right lineups in the first place. The optimizer is going to give you all of the lineups, all of the optimals from all the, basically not all of the sims, but a great deal of the sims of the game. And you're going in and choosing kind of the best ones for whatever edge you want to push. Maybe you think the edge is that the quarterbacks are going to be overowned at the captain spot, so you fade them, right? And you say, don't give me any lineups with Mahomes captain or Herbert captain, right? Or maybe you say that I think Chiefs onslaught, or actually, you know what? Even better. I think no one's going to play Chargers 5-1 stacks, right? So I'm going to just say I want 100% Chargers 5-1 stacks, right? Okay, in this case, it can't meet that. Maybe because let's remove let's do this. Let's put Herbert back in the pool as a captain and then go back to team stacks. Maybe instead of 100%, maybe we say I want to play at least 50% Chargers 5-1 stacks, for example. Can't meet that either. So a bad example in this particular case, but that's the idea here is think about it more as the selection process than the construction process, because the construction process is pretty well automated for you. So, but good question and welcome. Just so you know, also for anybody else that's joining this for the first time, I do this stream every single day, 2 p.m. Eastern, Monday through Friday, same time, same place. So if you are trying us out and have questions, always feel free to fire away. So, okay, quickly, I see other questions coming in live. That is awesome. We will get to everything today on stream, I promise, but I'm going to first jump and tackle some of the other questions that came in before the start of the stream here through email and through Slack. So this question is from Benny, and looks like Benny won a ticket to a big contest tonight. He said, how should I approach the NBA $1 million Mega 8 special tomorrow? My goal is mainly to get into the cash ranks, which is roughly top 19%. My guy Shady Advice offered some pretty sage advice, I would actually say here. And he said, just play like normal and assume you already get zero back. This is one of the main reasons I don't recommend playing satties that result in tickets way above your normal buy-in. You're setting yourself up for failure anytime you start having to overthink your process, because a single entry is so much of your bankroll in one night. And I don't know if I necessarily agree. It sounds like Benny got into this contest, the satellite, because it overlaid, and I think those can still be very positive EV. I don't know if I necessarily agree to never play these, but I do think you should come into this with the approach that you are going to lose it, right? If you are expecting to min cash, right, by default, you even mentioned here, Benny, yourself, that the payout is top 19%, right? You should go in, I think, at a baseline and assume that your chance of cashing in this is 19% and frame your reference there, right? And it's maybe even is less than that, because this contest is probably going to play pretty sharp, right? You're talking about a high stakes contest, probably a low entry limit. You're going to be playing against some sharp competition. So I would enjoy the sweat here, but I would not necessarily overinflate your odds in your head of what your likelihood is, even to min cash. From there, I would do your best to apply a process that is similar to what you typically do, right? Trying to reinvent the wheel here just because you're playing a high stakes single bullet is probably not the best approach. I would stick to what has been working for you. The default sliders are going to put you in a good spot of building you a pool of lineups that I think are going to be a good starting point from which to work from. And I would go from there. I would say because your expected value is going to be a little bit different than somebody that just bought into this contest, right? Because you're paying for basically whatever you paid for the satellite. Your lineups may have more expected. Your lineups may have more profitability or value to you in the min cash positions than somebody else that just bought into this. I would say you could err on the side of playing a little chalkier here, or if you're torn, especially between a 1v1 or a 2v2 or a 3v3 in your lineup, or between a couple different lineups, I think you can safely err on the side of playing a little bit chalkier. But I would plan to lose, frankly, because your baseline cash percent is 19%. Build a lineup that isn't just a cash lineup. Let me say that. Don't go in and play a cash lineup, because that lineup might have very little equity to cash at all, right? Build a GPP lineup, but stick to what works for you, and don't try to reinvent the wheel here right before playing a big stakes contest, and have fun with it, I would say. But yeah, good question there. All right, cool. I'm going to keep going. Again, I see more questions coming in live. That's awesome. We will hit everything, I promise. I want to go ahead and hit some of these other questions that came in at the start of the stream. And this one's from Pete. Pete also said, greetings from Germany here. So awesome to see we've got an international audience for this show here. But Pete said, in your video, building high upside NFL DFS lineups, you said that this strategy almost only makes sense for high variance Sim variance 10, GPPs 150 minimax. How could this strategy be adopted to contests with lower variance? As an example, unchecking players who do not get 15 plus points at 85th percentile instead of 95th percentile, shifting the negative leverage to be considered from -5% plus or minus negative 10% up to, okay, negative 10% to plus or minus negative 20. Does that make sense? And then, of course, greetings from Germany. What Pete is referring to, in case you're kind of lost a little bit here, at the end of this NFL DFS course that we've put out for this season, the last video in this course is called Building High Upside NFL DFS Lineups with SaberSim, and it is about a 1-hour walkthrough of me going through an actual NFL slate about 2 hours before the slate locked. I think I did this for like week 4, week 5 or something like that, showing how I use SaberSim, just one of the ways to apply a lot of the concepts that we talk about in this course here for my process. So Pete is referencing a lot of different things that come up in this video. I'm not going to be able to explain what he's talking about here across the board. If you're interested, I'd go and check this video out, especially after watching some of the other videos here. If you're new to SaberSim, I'd start with some of the videos earlier in this course and then work your way over here. But anyway, so really the fundamental concept here, though, that is important to grasp is that a big component of my process for an NFL slate is to run what I call research builds. These are builds on SaberSim that are run at 10 sim variance, 0 correlation, 0 ownership. I build 1,500 lineups. And what I am essentially doing is I'm using the sims. So I'm using single game simulations to build 1,500 lineups and basically ask SaberSim, what are 1,500 different optimal lineups, the actual optimal that could come out of the slate if we played it out 1,500 times. And then I do all kinds of stuff. I look at comparing a player's ownership to how often they show up in the optimal and make some determinations on some players I want to be over the field and under on and so on. And I combine that with also doing some player pool trimming, typically looking at the 95th or so percentile outcome to trim some players from the bottom of my pool that I just think have relatively lower upside. I think in the video, I said what I was doing is I was trimming off anybody that didn't have at least a 5% chance to score, well, not defenses, but flex players to score 15 points, right? The opportunity cost of rostering a player that even is min salary that only scores 12 points is typically too high to win on an NFL Sunday, right? So those are the kind of the core concepts here. So one of the things I also say in that video is that this strategy works best for sports where you are already playing, sports or contests where you're already playing with a very high sim variance. Because the assumption here is that a player's chance of showing up in the actual optimal scoring lineup is the same as that player's chance of scoring in the winning lineup in your contest. And that is true when by default, sim variance is very high. But in sports like NBA, especially on big slates or on just smaller contests for NFL, that isn't as true, right? And that assumption gets worse. Approximating how likely a player is to show up in the winning lineup for a contest by looking at how often they show up in the mathematical optimal becomes a worse assumption. So anyway, that's kind of the quick summary there. I guess maybe not so quick, but what Pete is saying is what's the answer to that? So what do we do then if we're playing a contest like this and that approximation gets bad? This question has actually come in a lot. I've had this asked of me many times here, and I don't entirely have like the perfect answer to this question. I think it's a challenging question to answer. I think, Pete, that you are probably on the right track here, and I think the approach here is right. This is kind of what I have done. I think if you are playing contests where the sim variance by default is lower, and you don't need what I'm basically saying is you don't need the complete nuts to win. I think raising your threshold of where you're going to fade a player or play a player is a good idea, right? If a player should be significantly more over or under leveraged for it to be worth making that stand on a player when you're playing like smaller contests, right? So if you were saying, like, for example, what I do is if I'm fading every player that has a negative 10% leverage on my research build for big NFL Sunday main slates, for something smaller, maybe I'm only taking that stand if they're negative 15% or negative 20 or something like that. I also think raising the threshold for what you need a player to score to be in your player pool, whether you're doing that by the percentile or the average projection, raising that a little bit more to lower some of those higher variance, low salary players, right, also makes more sense. So the lower the variance comes down in the contest, the more you should raise the threshold of where that minimum point projection is. For full disclosure, I have transitioned a little bit from thinking about things at the 95th percentile to actually just doing something at the average, mostly because since that video came out, we created a way to do it automatically all in one fell swoop here on the stacking rule. So in the video, I talked about sorting basically 95th percentile in reverse order and then just unchecking players until this number got to a point I wanted it to be. What I have since started doing instead is just based on the size of the slate, just using this nice filter tool to maybe trim off some other players from the bottom, right? Instead, because it's easier. So I haven't been looking at percentiles as much. But I again, to just kind of wrap this question up here, I haven't really answered this question for myself in necessarily the most satisfying way yet. I would say in lower variance sports and contest types and slates, I have just been less interested in doing the research build process and trying to find some of those big fades, right? But I think if you were applying the same concepts for some of these contests, I think the best thing I would recommend is raising your thresholds. Basically, it requires more for me to want to fade a player than it would otherwise. So let me know if that helps, Pete. I hopefully didn't leave anybody else watching here too much in the dark. I think there's kind of a lot of context required from this video and some of the other discussions we've had on this stream, to be completely honest. But it's definitely a good question, and I think you're thinking about it the right way if you're asking this question in the first place. So good question overall there. But all right, cool. Let's go ahead. Let's jump to this here. This is a question from Manny. This also came in Slack. And he said, can you please explain the pros and cons of using percentiles in SaberSim? For example, I saw that Mr. Clean in his NHL process changes his lineups to the 95th percentile, and those are the ones he plays. How does that affect the builds? Yeah, let's talk about this first, just from what does this do? Literally, what impact is this having on the process? And then we'll wrap around and we'll talk about pros and cons or reasons I think you should or shouldn't use this. So we'll do a quick build. We'll do NBA tonight, build 500 lineups or so here, and then we'll take a look. One thing to note here is that if you are going to use percentiles, and we want to add a note here in the app so that the messaging is clear here, but you won't be able to use these percentiles if you are using custom projections, basically of any kind, really. Whether that's if you're using like the run pure projections or an average of the two, or if you're using your own custom projections or are changing projections at all, right? You're not going to be able to, the percentiles won't really work. So good thing to note there. This is something that you would only really want to do if you weren't using custom projections at all. And maybe that's actually like a good note of like when to use it. But anyway, let's go ahead and say we were doing this, and let's say we're setting every player to the 85th percentile. So what's actually happening here, the lineups are already built. The sims are already run. Two things that common misconceptions. When you change this percentile to 85th percentile, we are not rerunning sims and we are not rebuilding the lineups. What we are doing is we are shifting every player's basically their distribution so that their new mean, right? So that their new mean outcome, whatever it was before, is now shifted to be the outcome that they score 15% of the time or less. That's because it's the 85th percentile outcome, right? So the net effect in general terms, what you get here is you get lineups. You sort to the top lineups that probably have a little bit higher upside or stand to win a little bit more when the upside is reached, right? When they have that outcome at the expense of average performance, right? The average performance of your lineups may go down a bit. Your min cash equity may go down a bit at the benefit of adding upside, right? The reason Mr. Clean, for example, talks about doing this in NHL and particularly upping it all the way to the 95th percentile, which is a pretty high outcome, is because hockey is a high variance sport, right? Players are not normally distributed, right? And differentiation is important, right? So really on the hockey side, right? Let me show you kind of what I mean here and how those three things come together. So this is true of baseball too. I did kind of an analysis of this over in baseball season, but especially for non-goalies, right? You are going to have skaters that are projected better than others on any given night, right? At the average. The value that you get of this slightly higher value for a player like Anthony Duclair at 5,700, projected around the same as some of these other high salary guys, is diminished as you go to the 95th percentile, right? These high variance players, we can just look at like a range of outcomes curve for some of these skaters. Their 95th percentile outcomes tend to kind of condense. They kind of approach a similar number most of the time, right? And despite the fact that one skater may have a much better average projection than another, right? We don't really care in GPPs what actually happens at the averages. We care what happens at the ceilings. So what you end up doing is when you sort and you build lineups here and you sort by 95th percentile, right? The net effect of that you get is basically say, in some ways, ignore the outcomes that don't even lead to my success in these contests to begin with. For Mr. Clean, that's anything under the 95th percentile outcome, right? And give me the lineups in my pool that are the best when the players reach that ceiling outcome. And because skaters in hockey and stacks and things like that have similar 95th percentile outcomes, or the difference between the best projected players and the worst projected players is closer at the 95th percentile than it is at the average, you end up with lineups that are typically more diversified, probably a little bit more contrarian, and don't really lose any ceiling equity. But they do lose the average outcome, right? Because you're playing players that are projected worse on average, but they have a similar ceiling. That is essentially what you get out of doing this. That's kind of the explanation for why I always say the quick answer is you get lineups with theoretically more upside at the expense of average performance, is because that's what actually happens, right? And we could probably see this here in a second, but typically it's not necessarily true for every single slate, but typically what you'll see is if we just look at our exposures to certain players and how often certain players show up in our pool, right? We will probably see that by updating this, so you can kind of get an idea, right? We have a lot of Colorado. We're pretty well exposed to a lot of Florida, pretty well exposed to our biggest players on the slate, right? If we change this to 95th, what we should see in general is some diversification. Now, we're still sorting through the entire pool of 500, so it won't be as diversified as building lineups at 95th percentile in the first place. Okay, so in this particular case, and maybe that's just the way the projections are working out this night, but in this particular case, we actually don't really see too much diversification from changing this. But that's, I would say, on average, what you would probably expect to happen. I think it's best used now, kind of moving to the pros and cons. I think this is best used for higher variance sports, right? Where your sim variance slider, if you're confused where that is, right? Where your sim variance slider is a little bit higher to begin with, or in sports where, right, like so you can see, like actually, I think I know what happened here. I didn't build these with the proper default settings. So we ended up with a lineup. We ended up with a lineup pool that was not as diverse as it should have been anyway. But you can see for hockey, right, for a 20 max, for example, right, the sim variance is going to be a lot higher than it is in a 10 game, an equivalently sized NBA slate, right? So sports where your sim variance slider is going to be high to begin with, I think this is a better idea. I also think, or slates, right? On an NBA slate that is 3 games or 4 games versus a 10 game slate, right? It makes more sense that slate is higher variance than a 10 game slate, right? I think it makes more sense there. I also think it's a good idea in sports that have less normally distributed players, right? In basketball, players are not perfectly normally distributed, but they are more normally distributed than another sport. And what I mean by that, just to be clear, is that you get a bell curve type look for a player's range of outcomes. And the reason why updating percentiles for NBA I don't think is going to provide as much value is because when you have this kind of bell curve type curve for a player, their 95th percentile is fairly predictable from their mean outcome. In other words, you don't actually end up with very different lineups changing your percentiles in a sport like NBA because the 95th percentile generally follows from the mean outcome. Right? If a player is a good play at the average, they're also probably a good play at the ceiling. Whereas in higher variance sports where players are not normally distributed, like hockey, baseball, even football to an extent, especially certain positions, that's not as much the case. So summing this up, right? We'll wrap this question up here. Overall, I think what you get out of using percentiles is you end up with lineups that probably have higher upside, are more differentiated, and are probably a bit more contrarian than using the average projection. I think they are best used on sports where players are not normally distributed and the sports or the slate or the contest plays very high variance to begin with. And you can't use them, at least at the moment with the way the app is set up, when you're using custom projections of any kind. So I feel like that's probably one of the more thorough responses I've given to the percentiles question on stream so far. So hopefully that was helpful. If you're asking for my personal take, it's not something that I use all too often. Personally, it just hasn't really kind of found its way into my process at all. But that's not to say it's a bad idea. And Mr. Clean uses them pretty heavily to quite a bit of success, at least in NHL. So definitely something to at least explore. So, and as always, especially for some of you that are maybe more new to SaberSim, the single best way to get familiar with what something does, what impact it has on your lineups or your player pool or anything like that, is experiment with it. And experiment with it when you have time, right? If you have 30 minutes before lock and you're trying to get lineups in, not the best time to go into the laboratory and start messing around with stuff, right? But when you have time and you have maybe a little bit of time at your lunch break or whatever during the day, go run some builds. Run some builds for NBA, run some builds for hockey, whatever you play, run some builds for NFL, and see what happens when you change the percentiles. See what that does to your exposures and your player pool and your lineups and things like that. The last note, I should have mentioned this before, is I would be very cautious in general with the 99th percentile overall. Those are extreme ceiling outcomes. Those are approximately three standard deviations away from the mean outcome at that point. Very low outcome events. You will see some pretty extreme scores there, especially at lower salary players, right? A 99th percentile outcome for Miles McBride, who I don't even know who that is, to be completely honest, on the Knicks, is a 40-point outcome at 3,500, right? These are pretty extreme outcomes. There's not necessarily it's wrong to do this, but just be prepared. I have seen before people go in, they build their lineups, they set it to 99th percentile, they enter their lineups without really looking at it, and they're like, why do I have 90% Josh Christopher? Like, who is Josh Christopher? What's going on here? Well, you sorted the lineups by what the 1% outcome was for all the players in the pool. So yeah, you got some weird names in there. You're taking some pretty high variance shots. That's the effect you get of that. So be careful with that. Those extreme percentiles. I would experiment with the 85th and 95th first. So good question. All right. So that was it here in terms of the questions that came in through Slack. So let's go ahead. We'll knock out the YouTube questions. And then I think I've got an email that had come in as well. So Nancy Drew Guy asks a good question here about basically a feature that is probably on its way, or actually, I doesn't even have to say probably. It is on its way. It's something that we've worked on. But Nancy Drew Guy says, is there any way in step 3 when you use the plus and minus buttons, is there a way to just choose those without unchecking each ranked lineup? So what we're talking about here is, let's say you were going in and basically using these filters to kind of cherry pick certain lineups, right? So let's go ahead and adjust some projections so we can see some lineups. And let's say you didn't want to, what's a good one here? Let's say you didn't want to play Derrick Rose and Evan Fournier together. So you pick Derrick Rose, you pick Evan Fournier. Is there a way to just remove all of these from your pool all at once, right? You can just go in here and check, but it's kind of tedious if you're playing a lot of lineups. And also when you fill these back in, lineups potentially with Rose and Fournier can be re-entered into your pool at that point, which can also be kind of frustrating. The answer to this at the moment is no. There's not a better way than just doing what I just showed here to remove those kinds of combinations of players from your pool, unfortunately. We do want to add that, though. That's something that we're working on. In fact, we want to just add a lot more robust control of how you can use the filters to get different exposures to players, different combinations of players, all that kind of stuff in step 3 here. So it's something that is coming, but at the moment, unfortunately, the best way you can do that is just by unchecking your lineups manually. So in general, I think this is probably just true in DFS in general, right? The more lineups you are going to play, right? The more lineups you're playing here, the more tedious that's going to be. I think in some ways, the more lineups you're going to play, the more you have to be willing to sacrifice a little bit of complete hands-on control to dial in every single lineup. And what you are gaining for that is more, you're lowering your variance and giving yourself more opportunities to win something, right? When you're playing 3 lineups, it's very easy, even with what we have available in the app right now, to go in and say, like, these are the exact 3 lineups I want to play. They have the exact combination of players I'm shooting for. But if that number is 150 lineups, it's much harder to do this kind of thing for every single player on the slate. What you may need to end up doing in that particular case is getting more comfortable with just adjusting things on a player exposure level, trading off knowing that you may not have the perfect combinations of every player in every single lineup, but you have 150 shots at it in that contest. And I think that's just true. I think that's in general, just with, like how much time there is to do these things, right? If you're playing, there's a big difference of the level of control you can have over your lineups if you're playing 3 versus if you're playing 150. So, but all that said, we do want to add tools to add a lot more functionality here and a lot more control over what lineups you end up getting in step 3. So, Chris said, maybe a hard question to answer, but do you guys have research/data on how many lineups finish in a top 1% score based on of a 500 build or a 1500 build through backtesting with just a general build using default sliders? So we do have, so we don't have it listed in top 1% equity, but we do calculate the actual expected value of lineups at each individual slider settings. So like when I say that the sliders are back tested for the sport and site and slate size and contest you're playing, right? We've actually literally calculated the EV of an entire, I think probably a 1500 lineup set. I'm not exactly sure how many lineups we build, right? But calculate the average expected value of each lineup in the pool at every combination of sliders, and where they are set is literally the highest expected value set of lineups on average. So that's kind of where that comes from. I have mentioned before here that like your average expectation, for example, if this was a pool of lineups, if this was actually built for, well, this isn't a very good example, but if you built a pool of 500 lineups for a 10,000 to 50K entrant contest, right? Built 500 lineups, your top 1% equity of what you would expect in your entire pool of 500 on average would be 5 lineups. 5 lineups would be in the top 1%. That would be if you were perfectly average. If they were perfectly average lineups, right? The reality is that that's not actually going to happen every single slate. And in sports that are very normally distributed, like NBA, what's probably more likely to happen is that, well, actually, forget that. On average, you would expect five lineups being in that top 1% of your pool of 500. But the reality is even in a sport that's lower variance like NBA, there's enough day-to-day variance that's not actually what you're going to get. You're probably going to have a lot of slates where there is 0. Then there are going to be slates where you have 20, right? And so on. But on average, we would expect, hopefully, that the lineups just purely produced just alone by the builder are at least beating the average expectation. And then, of course, you can add. The ceiling is basically unlimited of how much value you can add from there to improve that number, or just get better at selecting from that pool, right? Like there are things you can do to make it so that your average expectation of how many lineups are in the top 1% in your pool of 500 is 10, right? Or you can do things to add value such that you are selecting one of those lineups more often than you would expect in your pool of 20 that you're actually playing, right? But you can kind of just see, talking through this here, why our official contest selection recommendation is always to play as many lineups at the lowest stakes possible to smooth out that variance, right? I think this can be a little bit eye-opening, is that your expectation of, even in the 500 pool, not even the 20 that you're getting, of how many lineups are just in the top 1% of the contest, which might not even be a big night for you potentially, right? Top 1% can sometimes just be 3x. That's $3 on a $1 entry, right? Is only 5 out of your pool of 500. So it remains a high variance game, and the things you can do to lower your variance are always probably pretty highly encouraged in your process. So, okay, cool. Dondi says, how often should I reasonably expect to win within 1 year not doing any research using SaberSim? Yeah, I think Cody's follow-up here of win what is good. I mean, I'll say this much, right? Again, thinking about things from a top 1%. At a baseline, an average player is going to put a lineup in the top 1% of the contest 1% of the time. Players that are long-term profitable, and I would say in general excel at the game, probably are putting that lineup in the top 1%, maybe 1.4 to 1.8, or maybe even 2% if they're very good in the top 1%. Top 1% equity is not the end all be all. I know I talk about it a lot. I think it's one of the better tools we have to look at results. And I think it's at least very grounding of like, this is what I should expect. But that's a good baseline. And again, just looking at this, right? Let's hop over to the lobby just so I can talk about what top 1% means. Because top 1% is not necessarily a bink. And in fact, it generally isn't, right? Let's look at the 4-point play for tonight. So the top 1% in this particular contest, 17,800 people would be 178, right? So 178th place would be scoring on your $4, potentially anywhere from 20 to 25 bucks. So it's a 4 to 5x ish, right? Or it's a 5 to 6x ish, right? Which is good. But like, if you turned one of your entries into this contest into $25, you probably wouldn't even really realize what you did. But that was a top 1% outcome. And that's something that you're only expecting to happen at least maybe once every 2% of your lineups, right? So that sets the stage for what your expectations should be. I think most long-term profitable GPP players are probably more often than not playing for about one big win that kind of makes their season profitable across the entire season. If you get more than that, great. But that's kind of what it ultimately ends up looking like. You're not just donating the rest of your entries either. That's another important thing to remember, is that another thing I see often is like, oh, if I was maxing this contest out for $80 every night, then I need to bink it every, 6,000 divided by 80, every 75 slates, right? And that's also not true because you're winning back some of that money. Some of that money is kind of rotating through and so on, right? Or you have minor wins that aren't major wins and you kind of win a little bit of that money back. But that's kind of the baseline expectation for how often you should be expecting to win. So I do believe, and like I've even gone through seasons or sections of seasons where I've played very strictly just kind of based more around using kind of default SaberSim. I do believe that we would outpace the average 1% expectation from like a perfectly average player, just given the level of sophistication of what is actually going on behind the scenes here in terms of the sims and the sliders and things like that, compared to what literally the average DFS player is doing or what tools are available to them. But at the same time, this isn't a get rich scheme, nor is it a money printer. And if you want to like really maximize your ceiling outcome, you should be prepared to add value to the process in some way or another. And that's why I do these shows every day to help teach ways that you can do that. That's why there are hundreds of hours of YouTube content on our YouTube channel teaching ways to do that. That's why we have the Slack community that we do, packed full of a few thousand people trading ideas and talking about strategy and things like that to figure out what the best ways to do that are. So, but good question. Okay, let's see. Let's keep it going. Wes said, in the stacking options, how important is the correlation option? I currently have it at 2, too low. It depends on your sport quite a bit. In NBA, 2 is perfectly fine, is probably going to be the default option often for a lot of slates. In a 4-game slate like we have tonight, correlation is going to be generally off because what it more often than not takes to win on a 4-game NBA slate is having pretty close to just the nuts optimal that we don't even really care about correlation. For NBA, I think on a bigger slate, you'll see correlation somewhere between 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I would say that is probably too low for any high correlation sport. So NFL, for example, not Showdown, not talking Showdown. I'm talking classic main slates. A correlation level of 2 is probably a little low. You're going to see a lot of lineups in your pool that don't show up with any stacks, don't have a lot of other mini correlations in the lineup, may have even some negative correlations showing up. In hockey, that correlation of 2 is probably also too low. Overall, I don't feel like you need to be the one to figure out where the best sliders are to set. So as I was talking about earlier, right, these are back tested by running thousands of lineups at every single slider combination and comparing them to past contests. And of everything you can do on the app to add some value, I would say the last place I would look would be dialing in sliders. The sliders are very well set for the contest that you tell us you're playing to by default. So you can see for hockey, for example, right, we have a correlation of 8, very high. This is the high correlation sport. You want those line stacks, you want those power play stacks, etc. So I think you can add a lot more value tweaking your exposures in step 3. I think especially for new players, probably one of the more safe and also fairly intuitive places to start making adjustments is in step 3. After you have that nice big pool of lineups, make your adjustments. Maybe whether you want to manage risk and reduce your exposure to certain players. Maybe you like playing with a core and you want to lock a couple players in. Maybe you want to find leverage on some higher owned plays, or maybe get some lower owned sleeper type plays in there, right? Doing all that in step 3, I think is the best place to add value, especially as you're just getting started. So. Young Stunna here. I may need a little bit more information. You said, why does it let me pick a player pool size, but only select the people they want me to use? I'm a little lost here on this particular question. I would say if you have the approach of wanting to have a very specific player pool, right? If your strategy is like, I have a pool of 40 guys and I don't want anything that doesn't include those guys, the best advice I can give is to remove them in step 1, so that we just build you a better set of lineups that more accurately represents what you're trying to do, right? Even for tonight's slate, right, there's a pretty big player pool by default. And with as high as the sim variance slider is going to be for most of your contests that you'd be playing tonight, you're going to probably get some lineups that include almost every player that's projected over 15 or so points. So if you don't want those guys, just remove them in step 1, and then we should be able to build you a much better pool that does what you're trying to do. So Wes said, so in NFL, would higher correlations create NFL stacks itself based on projections? It would. I can show you. It is pretty sweet. So let's go to the main slate. We'll build some lineups. So again, real quick, just so you can see why this works, right? So if we pull up Kyler Murray, we can quantify exactly how correlated he is to his different pass catchers by looking at what the coefficient of correlation is between him and his pass catchers in all the different sims we have. And you can actually see, for example, for a for a rushing quarterback, his correlations with his receivers are actually going to be, or like a guy like Jalen Hurts, right? The correlations to his receivers are actually quite a bit lower than more of a pocket passer, like maybe somebody like Aaron Rodgers, right? Who's going to have extremely high correlations, right? We just saw Kyler Murray and Jalen Hurts were correlated like 0.15 to 0.25-ish to their receivers, right? You can see Rodgers is much higher correlated to his pass catchers. So what happens then is when we go in and build lineups, I'm not going to set a stacking rule, right? No stacking rule set here. I'm going to pick sliders that are set for basically a typical NFL Sunday contest for like a 20 max. Correlation is going to be high, 6 by default. That's where we think it should be set based on our back testing. And we can build lineups. And then what we'll see is that it is going to go through and it's going to start building these lineups. It's going to look at the game sims. It's going to look at the ownership of certain players. It's going to look at how correlated certain players are. And it's going to build this nice pool of 500 lineups for us. So we'll give this a second to build, and we'll see what we get out of this on the other side. Again, no rule set here. There are rules that you can set. You can dial this in a little bit more. You can also dial it in on step 3, but by default, you don't have to set rules. And you don't have to set rules on a team-by-team basis as well. That's another thing, right? Like, I'll show you what I mean in a second here, because it's pretty cool. So, okay, so let's go ahead. Let's make a couple adjustments to projections to see the lineups, and then go in and click stack types, and we can see right out of the gate, right? QB plus 2, QB plus 3, QB plus 1, QB plus 1 with a 2 run back, QB plus 2 with 1 run back. All these nice stack types, right? Pretty cool. And that, again, was without having to set any kind of rule or anything like that. Now, you can, of course, dial this in. You might say, this isn't enough. This isn't a big enough stack for what I want to play. Great. 0 max exposure to that stack type. We fill in with other lineups from our pool of 500 that match the 20, right? Maybe you say you don't want to play any lineups that don't have at least a run back in it, right? So we remove QB plus 3 or QB plus 2, QB plus 3, QB plus 4. Done. Every stack now has a run back. Maybe you say QB plus 4 is too big. Done. Right? So we're just dialing things in here. The coolest thing about this, and we can see this, we don't have any lineups that aren't stacked in our initial 500 that show up here. But one of the cool things that's cool about this, and I think is just interesting to see, is you can see in our broader pool of 500, even with a correlation of 6, we had a few lineups that showed up with no QB stack, right? Now, in a traditional optimizer, right, if you just built lineups, you would get a lot of random lineups that had no QB stacks because you didn't set a rule. And the lineup optimizer is just optimizing for average projection and it doesn't understand correlation. SaberSim understands correlation. So if we look, what QBs would we expect would be the kinds of QBs that in general, not 100% of the time, but would be the kind of QBs that could theoretically at least get there without being stacked, right? Let's look. Lamar Jackson, maybe Jimmy G is not the best option. Maybe Stafford's not the best example, but Lamar Jackson again, Tua, Lamar, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Russell Wilson, Lamar Jackson. Are these good lineups? That's up for you to decide. The builder didn't even give these to you as its primary lineups out of the 20. So the builder's saying, of our 500, we actually don't like any lineups that don't have a QB stack at all. But it is very cool, and I always think just very kind of interesting that the builder kind of picks up on the fact that the QBs that if they're going to get there without a stack at all, it's going to be the guys that have lower correlations to their pass catchers and are generally the rushing kinds of QBs. So, Wes said, I love the idea of creating correlated stacks without going through a bunch of settings for different scenarios. Yeah, it's great. And I think one of the other things that's really nice is that we will actually also pick up on other positive correlations appropriately. So like you will get mini stacks in the rest of your lineup at the appropriate rate at which those that makes sense to do that, right? So let's see if we can find a couple. Here's a good example, right? James Robinson, you can look at his correlations. His most positive correlation is actually to his own defense, followed by Trevor Lawrence. So we see in this particular lineup, we're getting that running back defense stack. That's kind of just showing up organically. Now we didn't set a rule to say put a running back with a defense in every single lineup because the correlations aren't so high that they need to be in every lineup. But we do get some of this showing up kind of organically here. You might also see, let's see if we can dig up another one. We're actually probably going to get a lot of Jaguars and James Robinson lineups because those guys are both in good spots. But here's another interesting one, right? We've got this like Lamar Jackson with Mark Andrews 1-to-1, no run back. But we have a mini stack showing up in the rest of the lineup with DJ Moore and Gabriel Davis and Dawson Knox, right? If we look at a guy like DJ Moore, right, we see a very, very kind of a thin correlation to Gabriel Davis, right? Actually, it looks like and then a very like thin positive correlation to Dawson Knox. So you can kind of get these like mini stacks showing up organically in the lineup because again, the builder gets correlation. So Wes says, I'm not a fan of forcing runbacks. I typically decide that based on price projections and who the opposing team offers as far as players. Yeah. And that's another thing that's kind of like going on behind the scenes is there's no forcing going on here. It's looking at the sims, and in the sims, we can kind of identify, does the opposing team have upside here, right? Is there an upside condition where it makes sense to include this player? We're not just jamming them in. And in general, like if we actually look at the games that are getting stacked, right? Even if let's look at our top 40 lineups, right? We're going to get games overall that the builder kind of thinks are games where that run back can kind of make some sense, where it makes sense to have exposure to both sides of the game. And I haven't studied the slate too much, and you may just flat out disagree with this. And maybe you say, like, where's Seattle and LA? And I mean, I don't know. It doesn't, there's other places to make adjustments, but you can kind of see, right? Like the games we're getting exposure to, Green Bay, Baltimore, Carolina, Buffalo, even Arizona, Detroit, right? Like maybe those are games where the upside matches the opposing side of the ball to include the run back. But anyway, I'm going to jump over here now, answer this question from Adam here. I know this is sports / slate size. Wow, that is really hard to say. Sport / slate size specific. Wow. It's kind of a tongue twister. But could you talk about how many lineups you look at for research builds? And do you weigh the percent of a player is optimal in, say, the top 100 lines versus 500 or 1,000? Yeah, no, that's a good question. For me, when I run research builds, I always want to include as many lineups as possible. So it's always 1,500. And I always study the full 1,500, right? I want as many data points as possible because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to approximate the real percent chance that that player is optimal in the slate, right? And talking assumptions here, probably the biggest assumption here, maybe you call it a flaw, but it's definitely an assumption, is that we can use a 1,500 sample size, a 1,500 slate simulation sample size to approximate the actual entire range of outcomes of the slate. That's also a big assumption. There's probably limitations to that assumption, but the most lineups that we can build at a time on SaberSim is 1,500. So I want to include as many slate sims as possible when I'm doing my research builds to make that assumption as good as possible. So I actually don't think it's sport/slate size specific. I think if you are going to run research builds, it is to your benefit to build as many lineups as possible for that. And for anybody else watching, again, is like what's going on here? Again, I'm not talking necessarily for the lineup build that you're actually ultimately going to use to fill your contests. I'm talking about builds that I use for research that are 0-0-10 to study the slate and see how often players show up optimal in those builds. For those builds, I always set pool size to 1,500, and I'll set this to 1,500 too, and look at the full pool of outcomes. So, all right. Good question, though. Adam said, hi. Yeah, I should have read that out loud. Yeah, it snuck up on me. It's not very easy to see what is going to be a tongue twister when you're reading it out loud, but then you get all caught up here and you say something silly. But Adam says, but on things like a showdown or turbo/night slate NBA, does it become a mistake to start weighing the full 1,500 set equally to the top 500 or something like that? I don't think so. I guess I get what you're saying, right? Like those lineups are still sorted, right? They're still sorted by Saber score. So there's an argument to be made that the lineups at the top the optimals at the top actually possess more upside than the ones at the bottom, and maybe we shouldn't treat each one equally. That's at least what I think you're saying. That's at least like what makes sense to me, is like maybe how often a player shows up in the top 100 or 500 has some different value than how often they show up in the top 1,500. That's an interesting idea. Yeah. So, I mean, let's say a guy shows up in 50% of the top 200, but 30% of the top 1,500. That's an interesting idea. I haven't really explored that too much. I would say that I think the value you get out of having a bigger sample size probably outweighs any value you get out of identifying what are truly the highest Saber score lineups in your top pool of 1,500. But it's an interesting idea for sure. I just think you may be seeing, if you're doing that, you may be seeing a pattern in there that doesn't actually exist. Like a player might be showing up in 50% in the top 200, but 30% in the top 1,500 by almost pure luck. Like there's not actually a reason why they're in the top 200s, other than the fact that by pure randomness, you got the right set of sims so that player showed up in the top 200 more, rather than it actually being a sign that player has more upside. I suppose it would be a decent tiebreaker though, maybe, like if you're torn between how to go on two different players based on your research, maybe break ties by looking at that. But I haven't thought about this too much, to be completely honest. So I don't know. It's interesting, but yeah, it's an interesting question. So yeah, I don't know. Good question. I'll have to think about that a little bit more. And it sounds like Adam says it's been something I've been doing a lot. I'm kind of unsure if I should. Yeah, I mean, I'm curious to hear, to see how it goes. And yeah. Adam says, I wonder if something like this for Showdown has more value for figuring out captain than util. I have found personally for me that when I do this process, I prefer to look at it more from the standpoint of captain ownership than anything else. Mostly because the captain ownership ends up kind of influencing the flex exposure ownership in a way that I think makes it difficult to know exactly what to do at flex. Like you may see, for example, on the slate tonight, you may see that the optimal move is to go overweight at Patrick Mahomes flex, for example. Well, you may say, okay, well then I'm going to play a bunch of Patrick Mahomes in the flex lineups, but the actual reason for that is because you're going well underweight on Mahomes captain. And even if you ended up getting there because you can't roster him at both flex and captain in the same spot, I think sometimes the actual leverage plays at the flex positions can be kind of obscured by the picture of the captain exposure. So I like to look at my captains first. I do think looking at doing the research build and looking at exposure versus ownership for players that are just never really going to be rostered at captain anyway, just like really low salary guys, punt plays, things like that can be interesting. I think that's where I like to use it. But if you're looking at players that are frequently going to be rostered at captain anyway, sometimes looking at the flex or the util spot or whatever for your research builds can sometimes kind of not show the whole story, at least without considering the context of how often players are showing up in the captain spot. So anyway, going down a little bit of a rabbit hole here. So I'm going to jump. This is the last question I have in the queue here for today. Okay, so actually real quick, I do see Kobe asked a question here. Kobe, I assume you are young stunna in my YouTube chat here. You said the same question here again with the player pool thing. I'm a little confused on what the issue is that you're running into, but if you're trying to limit your player pool, if you only want a certain set of players to choose from, just set that in step one. Just limit your player pool to be the exact players you want and then build lineups. And then you should stop running into whatever issues you're running into here. But let me know if I'm missing something there. And I'm going to go ahead and hit this last question that came in. And this is from, I just realized, I'm sure Six is still here. Sorry, Six. I didn't realize I'd forgotten about this question. So my apologies if you've been waiting this entire time to hear this answer. But let's get this one. Let's see. The question says, in step one, prior to running the sims, I typically invert the SaberSim projection from lowest to highest and begin dialing in my primary points filter while also referencing one of the 50, 75, 85th percentile outcomes to take a stance. Depending on the matchup and my general analysis of the lowest projected viable player's potential, I then proceed to set my include players where, I lost. Wait, what happened? I proceed to set my include players where my projection is greater than X filter. I've already watched the introduction videos on the SaberSim channel as well as Showdown specific channels, but I'm curious if your general thoughts may have changed or if you have a revised approach or findings or suggestions for approaching this step. No, overall, so like especially for a main slate, like my overall approach is very similar. I do like almost the exact same thing. I flip this around a lot of times. I like to turn this off so I'm not seeing players that have been removed from the pool, and I'll kind of make a determination of where I want this line to be. Normally, typically what I do is I figure out who's the last player that I would actually be comfortable seeing in my lineups if I just like started poking through lineups after lock, right? And it depends on the slate, but it's typically for DraftKings for NFL actually generally around somewhere of like 6 to 7 points, right? So maybe it's like Evan Ingram or something like that for this week. And I'll go in and again, I may use percentiles to help get me there or whatever, my own individual research. And then I'll go in, I'll remove defense from this and I'll say, don't include anybody projected for less than 6, and I'll set something like that. So I do something very similar for both NBA and NFL main slates. Since you mentioned Showdown here, though, I am going to talk about this on Showdown. I would actually really recommend not doing this at all for Showdown. I think including the players that are projected for very low point totals in your pool, guys that really don't even actually, in fact, I don't even think this should be here, personally. I think this should be 0. I think including players that are projected for just very low point totals, don't see the field that often, can be very useful because it makes your lineup very likely to be not duplicated. And what these players have to do to pay off their salary sometimes is very low, right? One of the ways you can visualize this, just to see this, for example, is to let all these players into your pool, build, we can just do 20, let's turn ownership fade off, use sim variance 10, right? And see how often these guys are actually showing up. And this is another example I always talk about, right? Like these aren't lineups that are showing up by pure luck here. It's the coolest part of the whole system. If you want to ask yourself, like, is it viable to actually roster a guy for projected less than a point, right? That is 200 salary. You can actually ask SaberSim that question and say, simulate the slate 500 times and show me the optimal, right? When you can see how often do those guys actually show up, right? Let's look in the entire pool of 500. In 500 sims, how often do these guys show up? And let's do this. Let's sort it, reverse order a salary. That's not going to be a good idea. Let's do it this way. Let's do it by projection, right? Our lowest projected players. Like these guys don't get there often, any one individually, but they all have sims even in a pool of 500 where they're there, right? This is a lineup where Blake Bell was optimal. Was literally optimal. This is a sim where Blake Bell was optimal. And you're probably getting him at like extremely low ownership and does a very good job of making your lineup unique. So for Showdowns in particular, my player pool that I typically set is I include every player that is at least projected for a non-zero point value, right? So Wes asks a very good question. What would be paying off a salary as far as projections? 7K you're looking for at least. Well, we can actually look at the 99th percentiles. So like for some of these guys, their 1% outcome, right? That happens 1% of the time or less is 1.5 or 2 points or 7 or 8 points, right? Like some of these guys, I guess, especially if you're looking at like maybe a tight end or a running back or something like that, you're like, this 99th percentile outcome is like probably what, two catches for 10 yards and a touchdown, right? They like get a cheeky touchdown on like a 1-yard throw or something like that. Well, since we know that in the sims, these outcomes are showing up 1% of the time or less, in another way, right? Like these actual outcomes that we're seeing here, you can, I guess what I'm saying is you can basically approximate that as that player's like absolute ceiling. Like that is probably what is happening in this game sim, right? Like when we are getting, especially looking at our percentage. So if I feel like I'm being confusing here, let me put this another way. If, not captains. Okay. All right. So this is a good example. If Gabe Neighbors is showing up in the optimal about 1% of the time, it is probably true that it is requiring his 95th percentile outcome to get there when that outcome occurs. And Gabe Neighbors' 99th percentile outcome is probably something like whatever, 4 points, right? So that's I think kind of a way of thinking about it here of like, what are we actually asking of these players to do? Well, how often are they getting there in the lineup in at least in a sample size of slate sims? And then what does that translate to in their percentile to be optimal? So Wes says, what about NBA 7K? You're looking at least what, 35 fantasy points? I think sometimes, so we were just talking earlier this week about this like target score kind of thing, right? Looking at certain players' target score, what do they need to pay off their salary? I think I don't like to go too far down this particular path because I think target scores are like a little bit outdated, really. Again, I think they kind of come from a land of not really being able to actually assess ceilings and how, like, what is an actual player's ceiling? How often do they get there? Like we can, since we have the sims available to us, right? I mean, I think the old school of thought of like 5 or 6x, or even using like a linear add-on to that and saying 5x plus 10 or something like that does a decent job of approximating. But I think you're better off kind of thinking about things from the percentiles in general, right? Like, I actually think this is a pretty interesting idea that I've never really thought about, but using the percent chance a player shows up in the optimal and then kind of reversing that. I don't know if this makes sense. I'm thinking through this out loud. But using the like kind of the inverse of how often the player shows up in the optimal and then looking at that player's percentile can be a way of basically approximating a target score. I'll show you what I mean. Let me look at this here real quick. So these are 0-0-10 builds. We ran 500, right? Or approximating what a player's percent chance of showing up in the optimal is. So for example, for our highest percent chance to be optimal player, at least at the moment right now, is David Duke tonight at 38%, which basically means that for him to show up in the optimal, he's scoring his 62nd percentile, which then could kind of be approximated as halfway between maybe his 95th, his 50th, and 85th, right? Which would be approximately, I don't know. Okay, you know what? We're too far into this now. Let's just do it. Anybody that's staying with me through this end of this here, through this end of the stream, I appreciate you because we're going into uncharted territory a little bit here. What I'm doing is I'm basically saying the percent chance of a player showing up optimal, right? They show up 38% of the time, which means like, what is the point total that they score 38% of the time or less? That's essentially their target score. So I'm going to calculate this for David Duke real quick. So 62nd percentile is 0.48 of the way from 27 to 35. So we can say 35 minus 27.3 times 0.48 plus 27.3. Okay, so we're basically saying that David Duke to be in the optimal is scoring 31 points or more. That essentially is his GPP target score now for the slate tonight, which I think is kind of interesting. For him in particular, that just so happens to be 31 divided by, that's 7x. So you're basically asking you're 7.4x. You're basically asking David Duke to be optimal tonight to score his 62nd percentile outcome and have a 77.4x night on a per salary basis. We could do a different player though. That just happened to be the first one I picked. We could pick a higher salary player, right? And actually it might be interesting because what we might find, actually I'm sure is what we're going to find, is we could take a higher salary player like Kevin Durant with a lower overall chance of being optimal, but realize, actually let's do Embiid. Actually, no, let's do Durant. Durant has a lower overall chance of being optimal than David Duke, but we're going to ask less of him on a point per dollar basis. I am almost certain of it. So 19% of the time for Durant, right? We're asking him to have his 81st percentile outcome, approximately. Actually, let's pick a player that fits cleanly into these percentiles so I don't have to do the math again. Let's look and see. Six says I'm here for the galaxy brain angle. Yeah, we're galaxy braining hardcore right now, for sure. Let's look at DeAndre Ayton, right, and just approximate that he shows up 15% of the time. So he needs his 85th percentile outcome to be optimal, right? So he needs 47 points to show up in the optimal lineup, approximately. 47 points divided by Ayton's salary is only 5.3x. So while Ayton is almost half as likely to show up in the optimal lineup than David Duke, for example, we are only asking of Ayton approximately 5.3 points per dollar on average for him to score, where we're asking David Duke 7.4 fantasy points per dollar, approximately. My mind's kind of blown right now. I think there's probably something. I think this is resting on something that maybe is a little funky. I don't know how valid this is. I think because of the fact that players are normally distributed and we can make a lot of these kind of assumptions here, this works. I don't even know what the practical application of this is. All Wes asked me about is like what's value and like what are we looking for in terms of NBA value, and I went down this rabbit hole here. But I don't know. I think it's kind of interesting. And I do think it's an interesting way of using a research build combined with percentiles to actually answer that question on a per player and per slate basis. If this slate was 10 games, we would actually be asking a lot more of players to get there because there's so much competition. There's so much opportunity cost to being rostered at a position. If we were going to use Ayton in our center position on a 10-game slate, it's probably not enough for him to have his 85th percentile outcome. We probably need his 95th percentile outcome. But this is kind of interesting. I may mess with this a little bit. So Adam says, what you could do with this exercise on real slates is look around the industry at places that provide things like Boom Bust or Smash Percent. Oh, I wonder who those two could be. Just kidding. And then try gauging how much that gets reflected in the SaberSim sims. Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, you could compare, right? Like you could treat how often a player, like we're essentially saying, we are roughly saying David Duke has a 38% boom percent, right? I guess, or smash percent, right? I know exactly which two competitors you're referring to here, Adam. Right? That's essentially what this is approximating. But again, it is an approximation because the player's percent chance of showing up in the optimal is not necessarily always reflective of that player's percent chance of being in the winning lineup. That's the big fundamental assumption here, right? But yeah, that's essentially what that is. So Wes says, what's the sims that Adam mentioned? Is there a simulator on the website? The app is a simulator. Everything starts with play-by-play game simulations of every game on the slate. So we simulate out these 4 games that we have for NBA tonight, thousands of times play-by-play. And what you are looking at here, when you click on a player's name, is the range of outcomes of what those players score and what percentage of sims they reach certain scores. You can also see how correlated or negatively correlated certain players are based on those simulations. And when we build lineups, right? What the sim variance slider actually does, what this actually does is every time we build a lineup, we take a random bucket of sims from every game on the slate and use the projections that those players scored in that set of sims to build that lineup. And then for the next lineup, we use a different set of sims. The higher this sim variance slider is, the smaller the bucket of sims is. So the higher variance you get, the more diversity you get. But everything kind of starts with the simulations. So. But Six said, I would love to challenge the Opto Bros to incorporate that algorithm and add that column using an automated process once the theory is proved, or if it's a galaxy brain theory, they scratch it. I'm pretty sure if I presented this to like Matt or Will, they'd be like, what? No. I have a feeling I'm a little off the rails here. I think the big problem here is that the assumption is I think the assumption is that like I actually feel like this is just overwhelmed with assumptions here. I don't even know if it's a good. I don't even know if it's a good idea that thinking about percentiles in the reverse order of how often they are to be optimal. I don't know. I don't know if that makes sense. But my brain's gonna explode today. So. Wes said, oh, okay, I'm sorry. I'm so used to just building settings and lineup. Sims is something I've never fooled around with. Yeah, no, I totally get it. And it's new. And it takes a little bit to realize that that's going on behind the scenes, because once you really internalize that, it changes the whole way you think about your process. Like it really does. The optimizer stops being like a spreadsheet or a calculator that you kind of have to fight to get to do what you want it to. And it actually ends up being, like, we use this in a lot of our marketing speak, but it's true. It ends up actually kind of being an advisor to you, right? Like you can actually ask SaberSim things in a weird way and get an actual valid response, because it's not just optimizing for average cash lineups. You are kind of querying or surveying a database of thousands of sims of the way the game could actually play out. So. Adam, you're also onto the right track here. I guess there's multiple ways a lineup could get there within a winning lineup, right? So maybe a winning lineup has David Duke go off for like 75%, and then also just near his median, and then a pay up near his median, but another has somebody else go 95th percentile and Duke just 67%. Yeah, 100%. Right. Yeah, I completely agree. But we're kind of thinking, this was really, I guess I'm really just thinking about if you're trying to approximate a target score for whatever reason. I think this is a decent way to do this. And I think it's actually probably the best way to do it that I can think of. But all you get ultimately out of that is a target score. And then it's ultimately up to you to decide what you're going to do with that. How does that fit into your process? But yes, there's a lot of actual diversity in how different, right? Like you could look at two different lineups that are theoretically optimals of two different slate sims and see David Duke in both of them. And in reality, what happened in that set of sims is very different. So, but yeah, cool. Wow. Well, that was a blast of a stream. Thank you to everybody that tuned in and asked questions, and especially stuck around the last 25 minutes in our little galaxy brain. I don't know what it's called. Rant. I don't know. It doesn't really feel like a rant because that felt kind of cooperative. Feels like we had some good conversation there. But anyway, was a bunch of fun. We'll be right back here again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern. So if you have questions overnight tonight, setting your lineups for Thursday Night Showdown or the NBA slate or whatever, as always, feel free to fire them off into our Slack channel, the Office Hours channel in Slack, or just email us, support@sabersim.com, or just come in and tune in live tomorrow and ask questions in YouTube chat. Good luck in your contests tonight. It is my first night in a couple days here playing main slates. Adam said, not a rant, very helpful. Thanks as always. Cody said, went off on a tangent for sure. Yeah, we did. But that's fun. Keeps it interesting. But anyway, as always, we'll be back here again tomorrow. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Good luck tonight, and